Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining AWSN's October webinar. We are joined by our speaker, Molly from Accenture. Welcome, Molly, and welcome to everyone who has joined us today. Before we begin the webinar, we look at the AWSN's Code of Conduct. Just on the next slide, yes. These webinars are interactive sessions, and we use this platform to share, learn, and network. AWSN's aim is to make these events a safe platform for everyone, and any unacceptable behavior will not be tolerated. Housekeeping. Note that this session is live. Please post your questions in the chat box. On the screen, you will see where the chat box is and how to post your questions. At the end of the session, we will answer the questions, so please keep sending the questions as the session progresses. The webinar will be for 40 minutes, leaving around 15 minutes for Q&A. Upcoming events. Wednesday, 4th November, a webinar by Microsoft on compromised recovery. 17th November, a webinar on ransomware. And 11th November, a panel session by Amy Roberts. Keeping in touch with AWSN. There's a few ways to join or interact with AWSN. You could also check the same details on AWSN website. The site also includes state-based context for chapter leads if you have any specific questions. Sponsors. AWSN would like to thank all our sponsors. They make possible the AWSN aim to support, inspire, act as role models, and grow the women in security community. Thank you to all our sponsors. Membership. AWSN is in the process of confirming membership. Please visit the website awsn.org.au and scroll down to our benefits AWSN membership to complete the form. So now that we have admin out of way, we move on to today's webinar. Today we are joined by Molly Day from Accenture. It is a pleasure for all of us to hear from Molly today. Thank you for your time today, Molly. Welcome to AWSN community. I shall now pass on to Molly to introduce herself, and we would love to know more about threat intelligence and your experience. Over to you, Molly.
Thank you, Reshma, and hi to everyone. Thank you all for joining this afternoon. It is my pleasure to be here. So today I'm going to talk about what I've learned from security operations from threat intelligence, and I'm going to talk you through some stories about things I've learned throughout my career in intelligence in both law enforcement and cybersecurity. So we're going to look at some examples where I've seen things go really well and where I've seen some things go not so well. As Reshma said, there is going to be an opportunity for questions, so please do post your questions throughout and we'll address those at the end. So who am I? A quick background. I'm the ANZ Threat Intelligence Lead at Accenture. So my role is helping companies build their own intelligence capabilities, doing research, looking at threat actors and their tactics and things like that. So let's start by having a look at what is threat intelligence. Now, there's lots of different definitions for this. I like to use a couple of pictures to show you how I feel our job kind of looks. It's a lot of investigation, a lot of researching things, and then basically pulling all of those different strings together to link them. Now that's looking at all different things like espionage activity, cyber criminals, hacktivists, etc. And the whole purpose of intelligence is to inform your business decision making. So that is exactly why it exists, so that you can make decisions based on evidence essentially. So I know so far it sounds very 007, but what often the movies forget to report is that it's not all very James Bond. There is definitely the less glamorous side to intelligence, and that is the report writing and all of the communication that goes around it. So it's not just investigation that we're doing, there is a whole bunch more work. And I guess one of the most important parts is being able to communicate what it is that you find. Now, I wholeheartedly believe that intel should be at the basis of everything that we're doing when it comes to security operations, because it is there to inform your decision making. Otherwise, you're basically just going in blind. You're trying to act on a million different things without actually understanding which threats you should care about. So I want to draw your attention to this little person here. And they're saying, I have threat intel, but it's not providing any value. What am I doing wrong? Now, I can imagine a few of you are probably nodding your head. I see this when I have conversations with lots of CISOs where they have intel, but they're not getting anything out of it. So typically that's when we see intel, it gets a bad rep because it's not being done properly. But if you are executing it properly and you have a really strong intel program in your business, it can often be the key that cracks the case. So one of my favorite things is having conversations with people and saying, do you like intel? Do you not like intel? It's the age-old debate in security of like blue team versus red team. And I like hearing their different reasons about why do you not like intel? Like, what is it that's not working for you? So today we're going to have a look at 6 different areas that I see organizations face over and over again. And that doesn't matter if it's a big organization with a huge budget or a small organization that's got, just a small amount of money to spend. Now, to start that off, we've got too much data. So companies are often ingesting a whole bunch of data, more than what they know what to do with. The second thing is that intel ends with IOCs. So IOCs are indicators of compromise, and that can be things like domains, IP addresses, that are basically a blacklist for the organization. They're known bad indicators. But often companies will just ingest a feed, and then that's it. That's the end of their intel program. The next challenge that we see is finding the right talent. And I think that's not just in the intel space, but it is security as a whole. We see lots of intel sharing failures, and there's some good stories I'm going to share around that. Unidentified stakeholders is a big one. And then lastly, budget restrictions. And that impacts all of us. It doesn't matter what part of the business you're in. We all have a limited amount of money that we can spend on our programs. So first, we're going to look at the data problems. So that is having too much data. Now, we're at a point where the industry and its level of maturity is that most companies are ingesting IOC feeds. So it's what you actually do with that data that really matters. Now, I like this image because it shows that you're basically ingesting everything, including the kitchen sink. And this is typically what happens. You ingest all of these different data points and data feeds that might not necessarily be relevant to your business. And then there comes the question of, do you actually have a person who can filter that out and pass on what's relevant? Because you might have millions of indicators that you're trying to take into your business, but there's only a handful that are actually relevant to your operations. So having the right person there is really important. They need to be able to derive value from what it is that you're paying for, and they need to be able to filter out the noise. Another problem that we see with these data feeds is that often legitimate indicators will end up in there. So depending on where you're sourcing this feed from, sometimes they're just open source, they're scraping from the internet, and then you'll see lots of false positives coming into your environment. So I've seen instances before where the Google domain, for whatever reason, will end up in this feed. And then if your systems are set up in such a way that you automatically block everything that comes in through this feed, then you suddenly block the Google domain and no one can access Google. So it's really important that you've got that process of analysis to determine what's actually important, what's a true positive, what might have been accidentally caught up. The other thing you have to watch out for is what we call red herrings. So that is where actors will sometimes throw in different indicators into things like virus total to basically make you think that that is a true indicator, even if it's not. And the last thing is, how unique is the data set? So it's always a good question to ask your Intel feed provider, how unique is the data that's going in here? Is it just being scraped off the internet? Is this actually truly valuable? And how high fidelity is the data that you're giving us? Now, on top of this, also from your feed, you need to be able to tell your stakeholders the data that they need. So ingesting data and then doing nothing with it is not going to give you really any value. From this data, you need to be able to go to your stakeholders and say, okay, these are the threat actors targeting our industry, or these are the threat actors that are targeting our geography, and this is the campaign that we're seeing over the past week or past 2 weeks. And who's hitting our peers? So that's all important data that you need to be able to get from not just your Intel feed, but your overall Intel program. Some of the other data that you want to be looking at is also when it comes to vulnerability management. So often what you'll see in these feeds is there'll be a whole bunch of different vulnerabilities that have been released each week, but some of them are not actually being actively exploited. So you need to be in a position as an Intel person to tell your vulnerability team, okay, you have 100 different vulnerabilities that you need to patch, but only 3 of them are being actively exploited. So they're the ones that you're going to patch as a priority. So that is basically where the IOC feed can fall short. They don't typically always have that sort of data about exploitation. And Intel is so much more than just those malicious indicators. So what I often see is organizations, they say, yes, like we're doing the Intels, but the IOC feed is where it ends, and that's it. And this is the challenge that we face. And that's also why I think Intel often gets a bad reputation. So that's not at all the fault of the Intel analyst too, by the way. I think there is a lot of confusion in the industry about what a strong Intel program actually looks like, but the Intel analyst can take action to determine which data needs to be filtered into the ops center and what needs to be filtered out. So the other thing that you do want to keep an eye out for here is making sure that you're not overwhelming a SOC or an operations person. I was chatting to a colleague yesterday and we were having a conversation about how they were basically filtering everything from that top funnel into the SOC and causing a whole bunch of false positives. So the SOC people are probably not going to like you as an Intel person if you're causing a whole bunch of false positives and a whole lot more work for them. So it's your job as the analyst to make sure that you're filtering down what actually matters, what's relevant to your business, what's relevant to your SOC. Okay, the other thing that I did want to highlight when it comes to data is that in terms of SOC operations is that lots of SOCs are still operating on the older model of just closing those tickets that come through. And that becomes a problem when you have a SOC analyst who is used to closing tickets and you get a true positive come through. And I've seen this happen numerous times where, for example, you might have a Cobalt strike beacon going off, and that is a pretty clear indicator that you have an incident on your hands. But because the analysts are just so used to closing all these false positives, they just close the Cobalt strike beacon alert. And that is bad news, as we know. So being in a position where you can refine those alerts down to just produce a small number of true positives puts your SOC analyst in a position where they go, okay, we think that these are true alerts, now we need to go and investigate instead of just sitting there closing tickets. And that's what we're seeing more of our advanced clients move to, is that Intel-driven model where they're acting based on evidence and they're not just stuck in that repetitive cycle of closing tickets. Okay, so beyond just the IOC feeds, there's so many other facets to an Intel program. So let's have a look at some of them. I want you to think of this as an umbrella. So we hear in the industry, people say threat intelligence, but often I hear a lot of confusion about what companies are actually looking for. Often they don't know. And I think that this is further complicated by vendors because everyone has a different name for everything. So I wanted to break this down to make it a bit clearer and put some labels on the different parts of Intel. So the first one we've covered is IOCs, and that's typically what everyone is doing. Everyone's got some sort of feed of data. But second to that, we've also got our geopolitical and strategic intelligence. Now that is your really valuable information about what's going on between countries, your higher level intel that can be fed up to the executive levels, and this does often get left behind. After that, we've got our threat intel platform. Now, I think of this as a data aggregator. So often this is a central point where a business will plug in all of their different feeds and basically the analyst will process all of the data that comes into that tip, as we call it. So there's open source ones, there's paid ones, but typically organizations who are ingesting multiple feeds will use that threat intel platform as part of their analysis cycle. After that, we've got brand protection. Now, this is something that is often, it falls under the Intel umbrella, but there's a lot of confusion around. So typically this is things like domain permutations that are copying your business name. It is anything that might threaten your reputation as a business. So there's definitely a lot of overlap between this, but I think it's important that it is segmented out because there's specific vendors that specialize in this. Sometimes organizations will do it themselves. but it is an entirely separate part of intelligence. We've got our darknet and closed source repositories and investigations. So that's looking at darknet, dark web forums, invitation only forums, all the places that you've got to be really careful when it comes to OPSEC. And then lastly, you've got your reconnaissance tooling. So if you're actually delivering this yourself in an organization, then you're going to need a number of different tools to do this. So they are a few of the different areas that I like to highlight. And the other thing is that it is absolutely expensive to run an Intel program. Often one of these on their own will cost you upwards of 100,000 AUD as kind of like a starting level. So it's always that debate of, do we build it ourselves? Do we buy it? Do we have the capability to run it? The other thing that I did want to touch on is also when it comes to RFPs. So I think one thing that I see frequently in RFPs is that the company will go out to RFP and say, hey, we need an Intel program, or we need threat intelligence. And then there'll be really kind of high level details about what they need. And I think it's because there's this lack of clarity around, these different areas. So it's good to have the conversations with your internal team. Is it tooling that they need? Is it a darknet repository that they need? Do we need a tip? So being really clear on that process and the different parts of Intel is also important. The next one is finding the right talent. Now, this is also critically important. We all have experienced this at some point in our jobs, I'm sure. It is really difficult to find the right person for this sort of job. And what I see often in companies is they'll spend all of this money on tools and feeds, and then they get to a point where they don't have the right person to run that Intel program. So the question is always asked, do we hire an ex-Intel person? Do we hire an ex-military person or a university grad? And there's going to be benefits to each of those, and everyone has their own different skill set. But finding an experienced Intel practitioner is really hard. So I think the other difficult part of that is striking the balance between someone who's got really strong technical skills and also someone who understands the intelligence trade craft itself. The other part of that is having strong communication skills. So one thing that I see very, very frequently in organizations is that they hire the techiest person in the room, which is, it's good in some ways and it's good for some things, but that person's strength might not be communicating. So that's completely fine, but if that person's job is to go out and speak to the executives and all of the different teams within the business collecting their Intel requirements, they might not be the right fit for that sort of role. Ideally, if you're in a company that's got a massive budget, you would have multiple people who are responsible for those different things. You'd have some on the tools, some doing collection, some doing delivery, but that's often not the case. And usually it's just one person who's trying to do all of these different things. So the key kind of characteristics that I'm looking for in an Intel person is, first of all, their ability to communicate, and that's verbally, but also in really clear written reports. I think one thing I was always taught coming up through intelligence, one of my old bosses said to me, if it's over a page, I'm not going to read it. So you have to keep things really clear and really concise. Make sure that your key message is at the top of the report so that whoever it is that's reading it, whether it's a vulnerability team or your CISO, they know exactly what they're getting out of this report. Another thing is integrity. That's absolutely critical. It's critical in our security industry, but also specifically when it comes to intelligence. Protecting your own company's information, sharing intelligence among other peers, all of that comes under the integrity umbrella. And it's something that I always ask the question when I'm interviewing people, because you need to be able to trust that person. And also their tech knowledge, do they have at least the basic kind of skills that they can translate technical concepts for a non-technical audience? And the last one, when it comes under tech skills, is if you're going to get that Intel person to do their own reconnaissance, you're expecting them to go onto the darknet and act in these forums, you need to make sure that they have the experience and the operational security to make sure that they're not going to compromise your business. And I've seen this time and time again where you've got a junior analyst come in and they're trying to do their best, but they completely blow an operation because they've uploaded files that are sensitive to VirusTotal, for example, or they have poor backstopping. So the threat actor is actually able to track them back and figure out who they are, what organization they work for. And the worst one, I think, is probably downloading malware onto a corporate network, for example. So you've got to be really careful that the person you're hiring, if you're expecting them to do that, they need to have the experience and the know-how to do it safely without compromising your organization. The next one is intelligence sharing. So this is an age-old debate that has been for more than I've been alive, I think. It's about need to know versus need to share. And you'll always hear different opinions on this. Some Intel practitioners think that Intel should only be, shared with people who need to know it. And then others are of the opinion of need to share, because Intel, in my opinion, is only valuable when it's shared with the right people. So I think it's important that you connect all of those dots and identify who it is that you need to be speaking to and share the intel in a very timely manner with them. The other problem that we see is that you've got these Intel practitioners who are just sitting on their gold. That's what I've got in the left-hand side photo. They're sitting on all of this amazing information, but they don't want to share it with anyone. They're like, no, I'm going to keep this close to my chest because it's all secret squirrel and we can't share this. But that's not good for the business. It's not good for anyone if the Intel team is just sitting on that data. It's really important that they know who it is they need to share with, and they have those trusted relationships to be able to reach out and say, hey, I've just come across this information and I think that this might be valuable to your team. I've seen an instance before where alerts have been triggered in environments. No one actioned it, no one spoke about it, no one shared that intelligence. And then within 3 days, that company was hit with ransomware as a result of no one having actioned that alert. So that just highlights the importance of making sure you have those communication channels and sharing what it is that you know. Another one is knowing who it is you need to call, what order you need to call them. Oftentimes we'll see it where someone somewhere in the business will see an alert, or they might get a phishing email, or they'll see some weird activity on an endpoint and they don't tell anyone, or they tell this random team over here, and then the incident response team or the ops team is last to find out, whereas they're actually the first people that you need to be talking to when you see strange activity. So identifying those sources and resources is really important. Anyone who you think is going to see weird activity, so your sysadmins, maybe it's people who are highly targeted with phishing emails, like HR, sales, your executives, get them in on it. So by involving them in that intelligence process and saying, hey, we know that you're someone who gets actively hit all the time, let us know. Then they're like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I'm linked in with the Intel team. I'll let them know whenever I see anything funny going on. So you've got to build those relationships and not just silo yourself into an individual function where you just sit on all the intel that you have. And the last thing is timeliness. So the problem that a lot of organizations have is that they'll find something out after the fact, and that's no good to anyone. It's no good having an incident and then an Intel person comes running in at the end saying, oh yeah, we saw this weird activity 2 weeks ago that might be linked to this specific threat actor. You need to be bringing that up to the attention of people before the fact. And that's the whole point of Intel, is being able to act proactively to get ahead of threats. So timeliness is absolutely critical. And also maintaining that tension of, do we keep things confidential or do we share it with people? This is, it's a conversation I frequently have with my manager. We're always discussing, do we rush this report and get it out? Do we wait and get it perfect? And we maintain that healthy tension of, he always wants to get things out ASAP. And I'm like, oh, we need to fix this. And we always have to strike that balance of, this is more valuable in the hands of our clients so that they can act on it today rather than us waiting tomorrow and then they get hit overnight, for example. All right, let's have a look at stakeholders. So understanding your stakeholders is absolutely critical. And this is where I see a lot of issues when it comes to Intel programs, is that the Intel program starts with the SOC, and that's it. That's all that people are doing. But in a strong Intel operation, it doesn't end with the SOC. There's all of these other parts of the business, and whether they know it or not, they have Intel collection requirements. So it's your job as an Intel person to understand what it is that they actually need and help them refine what intelligence is going to help them do their job in a more effective way. So to look at a few of these, we've got risk management teams, for example, third-party management. An example when it comes to third-party management, which is often, a stakeholder that people forget about, Let's say, for example, that your company is looking at bringing on a new software vendor. And as an Intel person, you know that there's a whole bunch of exploits for sale on a darknet forum for that vendor. Your third-party management team should probably know that. That's really important intel that you can share with them, and it's probably going to impact their decision of, should we bring this vendor on? You know, how secure are they? So it's important that you have those conversations. Same when it comes to red teaming and threat hunting. You know, threat hunting specifically, you can go to the threat hunting team and say, hey, you know, these 3 threat actors we've seen targeting the APAC region, and they're hitting financial services really hard this week. We're a bank, so why don't we go and do our threat hunting activities focusing on those? And it gives them a more targeted activity or more targeted program to go and look for. And then the same when it comes to corporate functions, for example. That's another one that often gets left behind. HR, finance, marketing, and legal, but they are all really important customers, if you will, of the Intel team. If we look at the legal team, for example, perhaps they're looking at doing a merger and acquisition. Then you might know something, or you might find something on the internet about the company that they're looking to acquire that's going to be useful for them. So it's good to communicate with them. And also just having a relationship with the legal team in the first place. You know, everything intelligence it can, you know, walk a fine line of being really risky. So I think it is important to make sure you've got an established relationship with them, so that if you're not sure about something, you can say, hey, you know, lawyer who's there to protect me, what do you think about this before I go and do something that might be risky? Same when it comes to finance. You know, finance is a big one when it comes to card data and things like that. Perhaps that might be part of your program where you're actively going out and looking for leaked card data. I've seen examples before where we found detailed instructions of how to hack a specific type of bank account. So then in that instance, we're able to go, it wasn't finance, but it was the developer team, and say, hey, you know, we've seen these detailed instructions. You guys need to go and alter this part of the code to make sure that people can't do that. But it is really important to look at your business, regardless of the size and scale, and understand who it is that are the people that are going to benefit from Intel, and have those frequent conversations to understand what they need. Okie doke. The other part that I wanted to touch on, I haven't put the Intel cycle in this presentation, but for anyone who's not familiar with it, the final step of the Intel cycle is feedback. So that is a really important step, and that is where let's say you produce a report for one of the teams. Let's say it's the security operations team, and it's absolutely not relevant to them. You need to know that, and you need to seek that feedback, so that way they can say, you know, this report's no good to us. We're not using this technology that you're writing reports about, for example. So having that feedback loop is really important, and that allows you to fine tune your Intel collection requirements to make it more and more relevant. So as time goes on, you're going to be producing more and more accurate reports and creating less work for them. And they're going to have a bit more trust in you that you're only going to give them stuff that's really important to them, that they actually care about and they will act on. The other one is budgets. Now, this is something that we all have to deal with, whether you're a huge organization or a small organization. Everyone is trying to maximize their budget. Now, it's a big debate about what do you do in-house, what do you do, what do you outsource, and striking that balance between, you know, what can you get your internal team to do? They can create bespoke reports, but also it's balancing that act between what can you get from a mature service provider who's got a global capability, for example, versus kind of your third option of just having a vanilla IOC feed. So I'm always a big advocate of looking internally and seeing what you've already got. So what do you already have access to in your network that you can utilize as part of your intelligence program? Now, there's lots of things. There's free IOC feeds. Obviously, there can be a question around the quality of that data, but they are available. There's endpoint data, incident logs, internal alerts, phishing emails. You can set up RSS feeds. There's programs like MISP you can use to manage all of your different feeds. There's sandboxing programs, things like domain tools and virus total. There's APT profiles that are publicly available. Everyone's familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, where you can map the threat actors' tactics against that framework. And then there's also things like trusted circles that you can get through your ISACs and also your industry peers. So intelligence is definitely very much around those relationships and having those strong networks that you can speak to understand what other organizations are seeing. So let's have a look at what strong intel programs typically look like. These are the kind of lessons that I've learned and the things that I've seen where things have gone well. And that is that companies are filtering out the noise. They're refining down the data that they're taking, they're analyzing it and just spitting out what is relevant to their teams. The second part of that is that they understand the breadth of an intel program and they rely on more than just IOCs. So they have IOC feeds, but they're also looking at that strategic and operational intel. They're looking at their brand protection and they're bringing that all together. The next one is finding your unicorn, but also being really clear about what your internal team has the capability to deliver and knowing what you need to outsource. The next one is having frequent intel sharing through multiple channels. This is something that we absolutely do at Accenture. We have really strong communication between all of our teams, whether that's our incident responders, our people overseas, etc., because intel is only good when it is shared and able to be acted on. The next one is strong stakeholder engagement. So make sure that you do identify all of the people in your business who should be receiving intel, who might benefit from it, and establish those relationships. And then make sure that you are getting constant feedback to understand what you're producing, make sure it's relevant to them, they're actually actioning it, they're not just sitting on it and putting it into an inbox that they're not reading. And the last one is maximizing your internal and your external sources. So to summarize, I would say if you do want to run a strong intelligence program that's going to drive a security operation capability, focusing on, sorry, I'm going to start that again. If you want to run a strong intel program and you're going to drive a security operations business run by intel, you need to be focusing on the threats that actually matter at that point in time, not just trying to whack-a-mole of all of the different things that are coming in without a clear understanding of what's actually impacting your business. Okay, that is everything from me. So I'm going to move on to any questions that have come through.